in their lives as well. Because I think we can all agree that in today's society, perhaps we've all encountered a certain book, a certain author, a certain person who doesn't see that the categories of good and evil should be applied at all. But I think what's more often is the question that always people ask is what is good and what is evil in any given situation. And I think we've all experienced in certain aspects of society today that some people promote an evil really thinking that it's a good. And our Lord reminds us today that we have to test to see what things are good. We can't take things on face value as good. Now, it doesn't mean that we should turn into suspicious and judgmental people, because the readings today could give us a wrong interpretation that say, okay, we need to be judgmental about everything. But that's not what our Lord tries to say today. And he speaks to that point in the gospel, but we'll get there in that moment. Okay? When we come to the book of Sirach, we see that the Lord through Sirach explains to us that it's all about evaluating people through how they speak. And the first example he uses is the example of a sieve. And a sieve is, usually it was a wicker basket or something with holes in the bottom. It's kind of like a colander when you're cooking or whatever that lets a lot of the stuff drain away so that you can find exactly what it is that you're looking for. And I think we can all agree today that when we talk about kind of discernment on all that information that's out there in the world today, we all have that process of having to sift through a lot of information. Okay? The internet is a perfect example of that. There is tons of stuff out there, and sometimes you got to wade through the junk to find the little nuggets of wisdom, the little nuggets of good. As Sirach talks about what the potter molds in the furnace, so tribulation is the test of the just. Somebody may talk a good game, quote unquote, but when things get tough is when you really identify what is in there. In the gospel today, he talks about out of the fullness of what you have inside, that kind of comes out. And when you're under pressure, I like to think of the image of when you have one of those Ziploc bags full of some liquid and you just have one little pinprick hole in it. When you squeeze it, something goes shooting out. And that's exactly it. It's under pressure that is the test of really whether good and evil have really taken good root in you. And really in that kind of a situation of urgency, emergency, whatever, that you find those things out. He uses the example of the potter's mold because it's once you fire that mold that if there's deformities in there, those deformities are stuck. But it's also in that moment that if the clay cracks or something, you realize that the clay wasn't well prepared to begin with. And lastly, he uses the example of the fruit of a tree, which is a teaching that our Lord will take up again in the gospel today. That the fruit of a tree shows the care it has had. We have to cultivate, people try to cultivate a refined cultural life, for example, and then it shows in their conversations, right? If they know about opera or literature, things like that, it's like, we say this is a cultivated person. It's somebody who's cultivated the finer arts and things like that. And when we try to live a good moral life, it's the same thing. The good comes out of what we say. It starts to shine. It starts to show. And that requires an effort on our part. Because as the second reading reminds us today, and it's not sort of the central thrust of what Paul is saying in this, Paul in the second reading today is talking about the glorification that we will enjoy of eternal life upon the resurrection of the dead. So when he's using that language about being clothed with incorruptibility and clothed with immortality, he's talking about the fact that we right now, as we live, as we exist, when that moment comes, just like Jesus was raised and glorified, so we too will be raised and glorified. And the discourse of testing good and evil is proven by the fact of two things that Paul alludes to today, the importance of it. The fact of sin and the fact of death. Even people who do not believe anything, atheists, atheist philosophers, all that, they all acknowledge that there's something in this life that is very troubling and vexing and that has to be addressed. The problem of evil and what's the purpose of this life if I'm going to die at the end of it? The problem of evil and the problem of death. And that has put everyone, believer and non-believer, in a quest to say, okay, what can I do about this situation? And if our Lord had not come into our lives to teach us about there was something beyond this life that we live down here on earth, it could easily just simply drive us to a life of futility. What would be the purpose of the life that I live if at the end of it I die and I'm gone and everything I've accomplished is gone? Even the ancient Greek philosophers actually believed in the immortality of the soul. They thought the soul lived on after death, even when the body was destroyed. However, they had some kind of strange ideas about the body being an evil thing because of some sin of knowledge from the beginning, like Plato and philosophers like that. But our Lord has brought us this wisdom to realize that death does not have the last word, because he has conquered death. We're starting Ash Wednesday. We're starting Lent this Wednesday with Ash Wednesday. And it's a prolonged preparation to celebrate the fact that our Lord came and not only taught us, but showed us that death and sin can be conquered definitively. And he not only teaches us how to do that, he empowers us to do that. He empowered us to do that through the power of his resurrection. So it's not an indifferent question when eternal life is at stake to see what is the good that we can seek and share in our life, and what is the evil that we should avoid and denounce in our life. And that brings us to the gospel this morning. Because there is that temptation to be judgmental. Okay, we all struggle against that. I think that's one of the biggest things that somebody who tries to live a spiritual life has to face. Because once you get all the material stuff in order, I know my catechism by rote. I come to Mass every Sunday. I go to confession when I need to, and all that. It starts turning into spiritual temptations, and the spiritual temptations all revolve around pride. And one of the big ones is to suddenly feel that you are superior to others, right? And that's when the judge-o-matic turns on. Sorry about that, when the judge-o-matic turns on. We start saying, like, okay, well, I got it all together, but this person is a disaster. Our Lord has already addressed that, for example, in the parable about the publican and the Pharisee going to pray. When the Pharisee was just looking down, he was spending more time praising himself and looking down on the tax collector who was next to him than actually praying to God. So our Lord reminds us today that we need to form our own clear vision. If not only we want to do good in our lives, but we want to help others do good in their lives as well. Because as he says, a blind person can't lead a blind person. Both will fall into the pit. Duh. Common sense from our Lord, right? So we need to form that moral vision of things. We need to form that ability to see what is good and what is evil. And we need to acknowledge, when he talks about the splinter as opposed to the wooden beam in our eye, we need to acknowledge as well that because of original sin and our own sins, sometimes our view of things is skewed. Because that corruptibility that Paul talks about in the second reading today is an acknowledgement of the fact that because of original sin and our own sins, we have a tendency to use good things in a bad way. Okay? But when that happens, it's not a question of, I see this as evil and I want to do this as evil. No. Because of that blinding factor, which are the wounds of original sin, we see that evil as good. And it's only with the help of our Lord and grace that we overcome that. So the first person we need to evaluate in terms of the good and evil of our actions are ourselves, before we can go out and view the actions of others. The actual wood, he talks about wooden beam in your own eye. If you look at the original word in the Greek, he's talking about a beam like one of these beams that are in the roof. So he's really being super exaggerating to make his point. I mean, imagine if you've got this beam this big sticking out of your eye, and you're saying, I think you got a speck in your eye or something, maybe an eyelash or something. You got a lot of work to do on your own before you start helping others. And everybody who is called, and we are called to a certain degree, to help others to do the right thing as well, we have to focus a lot and we have to work on ourselves first. And we have to acknowledge that. Our own faults and failings, that we have a clearer view of than anybody else. So when we see that contrast between the splinter in the eye as opposed to the beam in the eye, it's also acknowledging the fact that every person who stands in front of us is a universe, and we only see the surface. Which comes a little back to what Sirach was talking about today. Because when Sirach is talking about, look, you got to wait till they open their mouth first if you really want to evaluate whether they're just, whether they're wise, and all those things. It's acknowledging the fact that until that person in front of me really reveals themselves and their intentions and stuff, I really can't honestly say whether this is a good person or a bad person, whether there's something I can help them with, whether there's something that they can help me with. And that's a very important principle. We know the expression, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, here you go. The gospel backs that up. So when he talks about the trees bearing fruits, Sirach today talked about cultivating a tree. And when you cultivate a tree, it's shown in its fruits and things. our Lord is also teaching us today that we have to be realism. It's interesting that when you look at a lot of dramatic portrayals of dramatic situations, how many times do you find today in movies and novels and television programs that there's some vexing problem and being a goody two-shoes doesn't solve it, so we got to go to some nasty guy to sort it out, right? And unfortunately, some authors take the moral of the story being, well, he wasn't that nasty after all. Some authors, to be fair, they say, okay, that ended up being a big mistake. It's like I went to the mafia to solve my problems and I got sucked into the mafia world or whatever. We know that one of the important things in living the Christian life is gospel simplicity. Good is good, evil is evil, and we need the help of our Lord, His grace and His teaching in order to help us identify that. And once we do, we shouldn't delude ourselves, and that's what our Lord is teaching us today, to expect a lot of good to come out of something evil. Okay? Back when we had analog clocks with the arms that went around as opposed to digital clocks, Cardinal Rinze once said a few years ago, it was really funny, he said, look, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Right? And he was talking about analog clocks. Digital clocks, that example doesn't work anymore, but there's enough of us here to understand what the other kind of clock is with the little arms moving and the watches and all that stuff. And it's really true. Something good may come out of a bad thing once in a while, but you have to ask yourself, if I really want to achieve the good and help others to achieve the good, is it going to be going and just getting this maybe little nugget of good that they gave me by accident? Or do I really need to seek the good, find where the good is, get the word out about the good, and try and let that good take root in my own lives? And I think we all know the answer to that question. Even the Greek philosophers, their most basic ethical principle was do good and avoid evil. And that's why we need to do the same thing. Because it's not only wise from a philosophical point of view, from the point of view of a natural wisdom, but it's wise the way that our Lord teaches us as well. So as we continue the celebration of the Eucharist this last Sunday before we begin the season of Lent, let's ask our Lord to help us, especially as Lent starts on Wednesday, to have that renewed insight into the good and evil of things. Obviously, starting with the good and evil in our own lives, Lent is always a period where we reflect on how the year went, what we could have done better, what we could have done worse. And it's a moment for us to seek reconciliation for a lot of people. That's why it's very common for people to do their confession during the season of Lent. And let's also resolve that once we make that effort to get our own moral affairs in order, to try and help others in that process as well. Let's seek out those sources of good in our lives and in the lives of others, and let's try to share those sources of good as well, so that what we are full of by the time Lent is over, the fullness of our heart is the store of goodness in our heart. Because then we know the good is just going to bubble out. And what better thing to bubble out in our lives?